we can resume. Yeah, Maria will take care of it.
Yes, I will take care. Hi, everyone. And it's my pleasure to introduce Beate Krickel. She is a professor for philosophy of cognition at the Berlin, and she works on the metaphysics of science, philosophy of biology, cognitive science, and psychology, the metaphysics of mind, and causation. And her notable works for this workshop include making sense of interlevel causation mechanisms from a metaphysical perspective, and horizontal surgicality and mechanistic constitution. And thank you, and I'm going to introduce you. And
thank you very much. Can you hear me? Do I need to switch on?
No, it's fine.
Perfect.
I think everyone can hear, otherwise they will play.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really great. So as a philosopher, I'm always interested in collaborating with neuroscientists, and especially on that project. I just heard Matthew say that philosophers are like artists; they like to create problems, and I will create a few in this talk. I will talk about a problem. So my answer is no, that's the problem, or at least there's a challenge here. I won't talk that much about representational explanations because 30 minutes, that's impossible. But computational and representational explanations are interestingly related, so the representations will come up. So this is what I'm going to talk about. It's a planned project with my postdoc Beate Krickel and my colleague Neil Fresco from Ben Gurion and Peter Schulte. And it is on explanations in cognitive neuroscience, but I think it still interestingly generalizes to computational neuroscience, but maybe we can discuss what is actually the difference. But yeah. So so this is a project we've submitted, and let's hope that it's going to be accepted. But not only for this project, but especially for this project, I really love to collaborate more with neuroscientists. So it would be great if we could talk about this more afterwards. So what is the issue? When looking at papers in cognitive neuroscience, and probably somewhere in other areas of neuroscience as well, what you can see is that neuroscientific explanations of cognitive phenomena often mention mechanistic, computational, and representational aspects, and often they do so in one sentence. I had a list of examples. I won't give you these examples because there is not much time, but I will have some later. So now the question is, can an explanation be at the same time mechanistic and representational / computational? So what are neuroscientists doing there? Are they giving a unified, coherent explanation, or what actually are they doing there? And this is where the problem that we are going to create arises, what we call the compatibility challenge. So there is a challenge, at least, or a tension. What just happened? There it is. Okay. Namely, I will explain that there's a tension, and that shows that mechanistic explanation and representations, at least certain interpretations of computation, they seem to be incompatible, which means this at the top there, it's not okay to mention mechanistic, computational, and representational aspects in one and the same explanation. And this is what I want to show you. So here's what I'm going to do. Just very, very briefly tell you what philosophers think what mechanistic explanation is, then what they think what computational explanation is, and then I will explain why we think that this compatibility challenge arises. And then if I have time, I will present to you some potential strategies for dealing with this challenge, and these are exactly the strategies that we want to investigate in this planned project. So what is mechanistic explanation? So mechanistic explanation has become very popular in the last 20-25 years in the philosophy of science under the heading of the new mechanistic approach. So the so-called new mechanists, they give us an account of what scientific explanation is, and they give us an account of scientific explanation. Just very roughly, the basic idea is that to explain a phenomenon P is to describe the mechanism that brings about P. And I will say more on that in a minute. What is interesting about this account, in contrast to other philosophical accounts, is that this is supposed to be inspired by actual scientific practice in the life sciences and other special sciences like the neurosciences. So this is not so-called armchair philosophy where philosophers just sit at home and think about, oh, what is causation, what is explanation? But this is philosophers interacting with empirical scientists and trying to describe what they are doing and then deriving norms from this. So this is really interesting about what you think, whether this is actually what you're doing. So the new mechanistic approach then provides answers to the following questions. So there are further questions, but these are the core questions that I'm interested in. What actually is a mechanism? So what are scientists referring to when they explain a phenomenon mechanistically? How do mechanisms explain? What makes them explanatory? And how are mechanisms individuated and identified? And this on a conceptual and an empirical level. So what do empirical scientists actually do when they identify mechanisms? And how can we, on a conceptual level, say what is part of a mechanism and what isn't? I will bracket the second question because I don't have time. And the other two questions are more important here. So what is a mechanism? So probably as I'm talking, there are 1,000 more papers on the philosophy of mechanistic explanation being published. Maybe this is an exaggeration, but it's an ongoing debate in the philosophy of science. And they, like everywhere, yeah, probably everywhere in science, there are many disagreements still, but I think philosophers have come to an agreement more or less on how to characterize what a mechanism is. And this is more or less what most philosophers in this literature would agree on. Mechanism consists of acting and interacting entities in a certain temporal, spatial, causal, and hierarchical organization such that they constitute a phenomenon. What does that mean? One popular example of a mechanism is the action potential mechanism. And here you have acting and interacting entities. So you have ion channels, you have ions, and these are the entities, and they are active in a certain way, or they're acting in a certain way. The ion channels open and close, and the ions diffuse into the axon, and so on. Now, you cannot just take a bunch of ion channels and ions and put them together and have an action potential. They need to be organized in a certain way, so they need to open and close in a certain temporal order. They need to be spatially located at particular locations on the axon membrane. They need to causally interact in a certain way, and hierarchical organization is not too important for this talk, but it just means now you can even zoom in into every component of the mechanism and take that to be a phenomenon again and give a mechanistic explanation again. So the opening of the ion channel itself is mechanistically explained. And I'm here actually not focusing on causation, but on constitution. So the core idea of the new mechanism is that causal explanation is nice, but for neuroscience and so on, what is actually, what we should take a closer look at is constitutive explanation. And this is something what they think is new about this literature. And this diagram, also called the Craver diagram, because Carl Craver was the first to use it in his book in 2007, Explaining the Brain. So this is a very, very simple illustration of what this means. So the dotted line here means it's a constitutive relation. It's not a causal relation. We just heard from Matthew that philosophers think that causation requires that the cause precedes the effect. And here, mechanism and phenomenon, they occur in the same space-time region. And this is why they think it's not a causal relation. It's a constitutive relation. When you take the example of the action potential, so the action potential mechanism doesn't cause the action potential. In some sense, the action potential mechanism is the action potential. And what does is mean? Well, and they use this constitution notion in order to specify this relation. And now the idea is that this mechanism consists of a bunch of acting and interacting entities. This is my favorite illustration. So think of them as, so these are space-time worms. Philosophers like to talk about space-time worms. So these are entities acting over a certain period of time. So the temporal dimension is still important. And here you have causation. So these components, these acting and interacting components, they are causally interacting, and by causally interacting, they constitute a phenomenon. But the explanatory relation is vertical. The causal relation is horizontal. The phenomena, so this is what is called the phenomenon, is usually thought of as a behavior or property of a system. For example, it's the firing of a neuron, which is explained by the action potential mechanism, or it's a muscle contracting, which is explained by the interaction of mucin and I forgot the other protein, in interaction of different, thank you, of different protein filaments. So as I said, I won't say, yeah, some philosophers just mean, let's just think this dotted line is just the explanatory relation. So constitution and explanation is the same. This just in brackets, there's a lot to say more here. But what is more important is how are mechanisms individuated and identified? So that is on the conceptual level, what makes this thing a component and something else is not a component, and how do we empirically identify that this thing is a component and something else isn't? And the new mechanists think that these questions should be taken together so that the empirical identification tells us something about, on a conceptual level, what makes something a component. And what the new mechanists say is that the mechanism for the phenomenon P consists of those and only those acting entities that are constitutively relevant for the phenomenon. So the relationship between each individual component and the phenomenon is that of constitutive relevance, in contrast to causal relevance. So it's constitutive relevance. What does that mean? So there's a huge debate on what that actually means. I give you one account that I find more or less plausible. And this says, so an acting entity is constitutively relevant for a phenomenon if and only if three conditions hold. The acting entity is part of the system whose behavior or property is to be explained. And this is, in this picture, we already assume that. So being in this space-time region means to be a part of that system. Second, the acting entity and the phenomenon are mutually manipulable. And this, interestingly, I will say more on that in a minute, fits to what Conrad said about what neuroscientists actually believe about causation. But yeah, let's talk about this. And thirdly, the changes induced by this mutual manipulability are causally specific. So what does that mean? So usually the phenomenon is operationalized or then conceptualized as an input-output condition. So for example, yeah, the action potential is there are certain activations or signals reaching the cell soma, the neuron soma, and then the output is neurotransmitter release or whatever. Or in spatial navigation is putting a mouse into a maze and then the mouse finding the platform. This is our, yeah, how we operationalize, or how scientists operationalize different phenomena. And then the idea is that this input is just the input to the mechanism, and the output is the output of the mechanism. So we put the mouse into the maze. This is the input to our mechanism, and the mouse reaches the platform. This is the output of the mechanism. And now what we do in order to find out, for example, or to specify whether this is a component. So first condition is already satisfied in this picture. And now mutual manipulability means that there must be it must be possible to intervene or change the input and thereby change this component. In spatial memory, we put the mouse somewhere else into the maze and see whether this changes the hippocampus, for example. So this is the top-down intervention, and this is supposed to be inspired by actual neuroscience research and so on. But this is not enough. We need mutual manipulability, and that means we also must be possible to change this component, intervene into the component, and thereby change the output. So intervene into the hippocampus and see whether the mouse still finds the platform. And if this is the case, so the original account just had these two conditions, and then people said, well, there are obvious counterexamples. If I put the mouse into the maze, the mouse's heartbeat will increase. And if I take out the heart, the mouse won't find the platform. So the heart will be a component in the mechanism for spatial memory in that case. And that's weird. The heart isn't considered to be a component there. And this is why some people argue we need to add this third condition, that these changes we induce here must be causally specific. That means that it's not just taking the thing out and see that something changes, but you need to be able to make particular tiny changes and thereby make proportional changes in the output, so that you can make very specific changes to the hippocampus and thereby induce very specific changes in what the mouse is doing with regard to navigation. Do you have a question?
I would argue that the heart and the heartbeat are actually mechanisms in this. I think that they are not mechanisms if you conceptualize it as an operation only done by the brain, not the body.
So you would say that the heart is part of the mechanism for spatial navigation. Yeah, I mean, probably the intuitions differ here. They would say, if you look into a textbook on spatial navigation, they won't mention the heart. They would say the heart is a background condition. Of course, you need the heartbeat in order to do spatial navigation, but it doesn't explain spatial navigation. It's just in the background of spatial navigation. One note on mutual manipulability, it's an idealized notion relying on interventionist approaches to causation, actually. So they take an account of causation and turn it into an account of constitutive relevance. And this always means, and this is why I'm happy to be a philosopher, we can just accept everything is kept fixed. We can intervene into the hippocampus and keep everything else fixed. And if this will change the output, then we have established that there is this bottom-up manipulability. But of course, we are aware of the fact that this is an idealization, and if people actually do research on that, it's much more complicated. Okay, so this is all what I wanted to say about mechanistic explanation. Now I want to say or tell you what philosophers, or what philosophers think about computational explanation. So what is computational explanation? Roughly, it is to say that S, a subject or system, can do B, so show a certain behavior, because S's brain computes function F. Examples are, humans have 3D vision because based on information from both retinas, a 3D image is computed. And then there is an interesting function that I think David Moore talked about, how this is done. Another example that also many philosophers talk about, like Francis Egan, we can keep a stable eye position because there is a multi-stable recurrent network located in the brainstem that takes as inputs transient eye velocities and gives as output persistent eye positions. So this is taken to be a computational explanation. Actually, it is already mentioning mechanistic details, so it's saying it's in the brainstem. So what is computation? What does that mean? And I think computation is one of the most difficult concepts to understand, actually, what it is. So I will just throw one characterization at you, and it would be really interesting to discuss whether you agree with that. So computation, according to many philosophers, is the manipulation of vehicles in accordance with a rule that is sensitive only to the degree of variation between the vehicles. What does that mean? So vehicles are just physical entities like neurons or transistors. The rule is an abstract mathematical description of these vehicles' interactions. And the sensitivity means that there are only specific physical differences between the vehicles that are relevant for the rule, for this rule to be an accurate description. And often it is not so clear what exactly these physical differences are, but some say that with regard to the brain, it's neural firing frequencies or whatever. And for digital computers, it's on versus off states in the transistors. Okay, I will give you a toy example. So I love toy examples because they allow you to ignore all the complicated empirical details. But of course, they always have the danger that they are making things too simple and maybe thereby not really addressing what is really going on. But I think it shows an interesting point. But again, let's discuss whether this captures what computational explanation is really about. So let's assume we have a very, very easy, simple device D, and device D takes two different inputs and produces an output. And let's assume this is a neuron or some other device working with different electric volts. So the input, so here you can see the values that the input can have. These are the values of the input 2, and this is the output. And now when you look at this, so this is what you know about this device. Now you can ask, why does D produce these outputs given these inputs? So this is asking for a computational explanation, or this can be interpreted as asking for a computational explanation. And when looking at this, well, one intuitive option would be, oh, let's interpret these values from 0 to 5 as no or as false, and this is true. And then this will turn into a truth table, which looks like this. So then you have input 1 and 2 are false, and then the output is false, and so on. And everyone who had an introduction into logic would think, oh, this looks familiar. This looks like an AND function. So apparently D is computing an AND function. And this explains why D is producing these outputs given these inputs, because it's an AND function. But then someone else could say, well, one moment, I would describe this completely differently. I would say, well, why not do this? So the values from 0 to 5 is true, and 5 to 10 is false. And if you look at this, well, this looks more like an OR function. And then you would say, no, D is producing these outputs, given these inputs, because it is computing an OR function. And then you would think, is this even explanatory, given that either it's an AND function or an OR function? How can it be both? How can this be explanatory, given that it seems to be inconsistent? And this is one of the philosophical problems that people create. It's the problem of computational individuation. So it's the question, which function does this neural network or this device D, which function does it compute? And then some argue this is determined by purely mechanistic detail. We just have to know stuff about the brain and the brain's biology, and then we can determine the function. And some would say, no, this is impossible. We need semantics, and this is where representation comes in. So we need a semantic interpretation of this vehicle, and that means we have to look outside. We have to look at the representational content, and I will say more on that in a minute. So there is this more or less big discussion going on in philosophy of cognition about this computational individuation, and the contemporary philosophical literature more or less divides into two parts or two camps. There is the mechanistic account, or inspired by the mechanistic account of explanation that I introduced a couple of minutes ago. And then there are representational accounts. And they both provide different answers on how to solve this computational individuation problem. And mechanistic accounts, they would say, well, it's the mechanisms or these evolutionary functions. So it's just biological information. It is the question, well, what was the device designed to do? Or what was the neuromechanism designed to do by biological evolution? So this is, yeah, just a selection. Their mechanistic account not making that assumption, but this is what is relevant here. And representational accounts would say, no, it is the fact that the inputs and outputs and the device D represents something, and that is often interpreted as co-varying. I will say, give you an example in a minute. And sometimes they combine it with these teleological evolutionary functional accounts. So when we look at our toy example, how would these accounts solve that issue? So they would say, well, we have to look at what exactly the inputs and the outputs are in the real world. So let's assume that this is a neuromechanism, and that the input and the output is a lion. So if there is a, why can't you see this here? Somehow not working anymore. That's strange. On my screen it is. Okay, weird. Ihre Internetverbindung ist instabil. Okay, let's see. Okay. So the idea is, let's assume that input 1 occurs when there's a lion, input 2 occurs when there is a tiger, and the output is fleeing. Then it makes sense to say, well, the proper interpretation of this table is this. So it should be, so the output should be true in all cases when there's either a lion or a tiger. And then we would say, so yeah, the representational accounts would say, what this means is that D represents that there's a lion or tiger present. And input 2 represents tigers, input 1 represents lions, and the output represents fleeing or not fleeing. And the mechanistic accounts, those referring to biological function, would say, well, D's biological function is to enable flight behavior. And because this is the function, this is the correct interpretation. So that means the correct interpretation here is that D is computing an OR function. And we know that because we have added the biological function or representation. And if we, on the other hand, assume that input 1 and 2 are, input 1 happens whenever there's nutritious stuff in the environment. Input 2 is when it is non-poisonous, and the output is eating or not eating. Then it makes more sense to interpret exactly the same physical happening in this sense. So here we should be very safe and only eat something if it is nutritious and non-poisonous, and not if it's either or. So that we can say D represents nutritious and non-poisonous food. This is what the representational accounts would say. And D's biological function could be here, for example, enable food intake. And based on these assumptions, we can say what is happening here is that D is computing the N function. And thereby we have given this computational explanation. But now, how much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay, good. This is where I think, where we think the compatibility challenge arises. So this is, the compatibility challenge is the following. First, computational and representational explanations are, if at all, explanatory because they refer to something in the organism's past or environment, biological function, representational aspects. Mechanistic explanation can only refer to elements inside the boundaries of the phenomenon. Thus, explanations of cognition cannot be at the same time mechanistic and computational or representational. And here's why this is the case. So from what the new mechanists think about mechanistic explanation, what we need to ask is, can representations of biological functions and so on, can they be constitutively relevant? This was the mechanist definition of what it means to be a component. And this is what Beate has developed in his book that is forthcoming. So I'm taking this from his work. This is his work. So how is that the case? So remember this picture. What we need to ask is, can biological functions or representations be a component here? And first of all, the problem is that representations and biological functions and so on, they are not really entities or activities, but they are more like they are properties of vehicles. So a neuron can have the property of having a biological function. But this is maybe boring philosophical detail. But what we need to ask is whether these properties can be constitutively relevant. We need to revise the account a little bit to make it applicable to properties as well. But if we do so, the answer is no. Because, well, these properties are non-local as they supervene on things outside the boundaries of the phenomenon. So that just means, for example, according to the representational account, this vehicle would represent tigers because it would causally covary with them. So whenever there's a tiger, this thing would occur. And whenever this thing occurs, there's a tiger, but the tiger is in the environment. And that means that the property of representing a tiger is not just up to this thing here. So, yeah. And similar, you have problems with the intervening. So you cannot you cannot intervene into this component and thereby change its representational content. You would have to intervene into the environment. So that means there's a tension here. Do I still have time to talk about the strategies? We can also discuss strategies together. Okay. So this is the starting point of the project, this problem. So what to do with it? And here are two possibilities, I think. Philosophical accounts do not yet capture what cognitive neuroscience are de facto doing and what they mean by mechanism, representation, or computation. So maybe philosophers are just wrong. Or cognitive neuroscientists are doing something wrong, at least on the conceptual level. So this is philosophy. So it's just about what they talk about. So the explanations that they give, are they conceptually consistent? And the strategies would be to argue that computation and representational descriptions are not really explanations, but they are only helpful descriptions for us. So it's not really explanation. It's just for us as scientists or whatever, it somehow makes it more manageable to really understand what the brain is doing, but it's not really explanatory. In fact, purely mechanistic or neuro explanation is enough. But of course, as a matter of fact, we don't have any complete mechanistic explanations yet, but this is the problem for not for philosophers to solve. Or secondly, mechanistic explanation can refer to computational or representational aspects. So these explanations that cognitive neuroscientists are giving, they are fine. However, we have not fully understood what computation and representational explanations actually are. So what does it mean that a neuron or neural population represents something or computes something? And maybe we have even misunderstood mechanistic explanation and how mechanistic explanation works. And in this project, we want to use a method called adversarial collaboration. So we have some people saying, this must be true, and we have some people saying, this must be true. And we're trying to work together and challenge each other in developing these strategies. I think that's it. These are just a few references. So thank you.